Falcherash. Good morning. Hello, everyone, and a very warm welcome back to this new season of the Plurilingual Lab Speaker Series. Is mis Palmiach an Chiblo sé géla chanam agus hami a Glasgow an Alapa, sé ransacha a chanam agus isma ur Cónyachuig. So my name is Paul Megan Chiblo. I'm McGill from Glasgow, Scotland, and it's nice to be hosting you all today. I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of Integrated Studies and Education, and I'll be introducing our speaker for today, for which we're very excited. Before I introduce our wonderful panel speaker today, I would like to begin with a land acknowledgement. I'm speaking to you today from Toronto. I would like to acknowledge the plants, the land, the water, the animals and spirits, and all of our responsibilities to them. For thousands of years, Toronto has been the traditional land and territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and today is now home to many diverse First Nation, Métis, Inuit peoples and First Nations peoples. I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to work and to live on this land. Miigwech agus tapaleif. Now, without further ado, it's my great honor to introduce you to our wonderful panel speaker, Dr. Peter da Costa, and his talk today is called Unpacking Profit and Pride in EMI Higher Education, How Universities Manage this Precarious Balancing Act. Before I do so, I'd just like to go through some Zoom etiquette, please. During the talk, if you could please keep your video and sound off, and you can, of course, react during the talk using the thumbs up and the hands down clapping feature. After the talk, there will be a Q&A discussion for 30 minutes. You can post your questions in the chat during the talk by Dr. da Costa, or you can unmute your microphone and answer a question at the end. The discussion will be moderated by Li Peng and Ben Kalman and will not be recorded. And just to make you aware, there will be a recording available on the Plurilingual Lab YouTube channel afterwards, so you can watch that. So Dr. Peter da Costa is an associate professor in the Department of Linguistics, Languages and Cultures and the Department of Teacher Education at Michigan State University. His research areas include emotions, identity, ideology, and ethics in educational linguistics. He also studies social injustice and justice issues. He is the co-editor of TESOL Quarterly and the second vice president of the American Association for Applied Linguistics. So I would now like to pass the floor over to Dr. da Costa. We are very excited for your talk, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Paul, for that wonderful introduction. I'd like to also thank Angelica and the rest of the be here with you, and thank you all of you for taking the time. I'm going to start by kind of again reintroducing myself so that you understand where I'm coming from. As mentioned by Paul, I do work in the area of identity, ideology, and emotion, and I'm very much coming from the perspective of a language teacher educator today and someone who has interests in SLA and language policy and planning. I've always been interested in the global flows of people and ideas and cultures. And in fact, my dissertation, which was based in Singapore, the country that I'm originally from, looked at the identity and ideology in language learning involving students from Asia. 2 years ago, I put out this article that looked at multilingualism, elite multilingualism, affect and neoliberalism. And this is an indication of how my interests have kind of expanded to include emotion, affect. I'm not endorsing elite multilingualism, but in fact, both, and have that juxtaposed with elite multilingualism. So an enduring interest of mine has been, and commitment of mine has been to look at the access to resources that different individuals face. And today I'm going to look at that topic in relation to identity, ideology, and emotion. And as mentioned earlier, I'm going to examine it from an SLA, second language teacher education, and language policy perspective. To that end, I'm going to focus on two phenomena. The first being EMI, English Medium Instruction. TNHE stands for transnational higher education, and the second phenomenon would be global academic publishing. I'll be drawing on several papers from one of two special issues on EMI TNHE. Primarily, I'm focusing on the first one that came out earlier this summer, and it appeared in the annual Australian Review of Applied Linguistics. And I'll also be drawing on a study specifically from another guest-edited special issue that I did with my colleagues here, Joseph Park and Lionel Wee. So let's look at the first phenomenon, EMI TNHE. In January of 2020, together with my students, Curtis Green Inix and Wendy Lee, we put out a paper that was published in English Today. It was titled Problematizing EMI. E refers to any institution that through the delivery of either distance partner support or branch campus that enrolls students from a country other than the one in which the awarding institution is based. So for example, think about Duke Kunshan. So Duke University has a campus just outside of Shanghai, China, in Kunshan. And so they have an international branch campus located there. And these institutions rely on the mobility of programs, personnel, and students in order to transcend the boundaries surrounding the institution. So what we have here, as mentioned, is a movement of people, ideas, personnel, right? And I draw on the work by Phan Le Ha that you see on the left and other educational scholars. What's important, as we pointed out in our English Today article, is that academic institutions are also significant major language policy arbiters, okay, because they connect policies at the societal and interpersonal levels, which is the use of the English language to teach academic subjects in countries or jurisdictions where the first language of the majority of the population is not English. Specifically, I'd like to emphasize that EMI is enabled by TNHE, but at the same time, TNHE is mediated through EMI, hence the term EMI TNHE. So in our editorial to the special issue of the Australian Review of Applied Linguistics, we situated EMI in this figure, borrowing the figure by ARI 2016, in the right end of the spectrum, where the focus is on content-oriented learning outcomes. CLIL, content and language integrated learning, sits in the middle, and on the far left, we have EAP courses, for example, that focus on language-oriented learning outcomes. At the same time, I'd like to add that EMI, while it can take the form that I mentioned earlier, such as international branch campuses of a foreign university, EMI TNH can also refer to an EMI university set up by local government or educational authorities to serve local students. On those two other special issues on EMI TNHE, as you all know, we've been hit by the COVID-19 pandemic, and I would say that the pandemic has in many ways complicated this phenomenon because of a number of issues. Students elected to stay in their home countries to take online courses and not travel to other countries, and in many cases this was not even an option because the borders were closed. So to some extent it turned out to be a good thing to have some branch campuses in their home countries. So in this funky diagram here, I want to emphasize that we were interested in looking at how transnational higher education gets mediated or plays out, is implemented in ways that affect the day-to-day work and lives of different stakeholders, or I would like to see them as language arbiters, and they would include students, teachers, and administrators. So the 4 questions we posed in our editorial were: why do students enroll in EMI TNHE programs? of these programs. I'm going to go through each question very briefly with you. So why exactly do they enroll in these programs? Well, students are drawn partly because they believe that being educated in English will enhance their social mobility. So they acquire the capital that will set them up for good careers. Okay, they're also drawn to these programs because the programs are often constructed in rather elite, exclusive terms. For example, there are gatekeepers that take the form of minimum IELTS scores that might be imposed for admission. And finally, I think another attraction to these programs is that these students expect that the English language proficiency will increase or improve by virtue of being enrolled in such a program. So that kind of brings us to what I would say a very tangential way of looking at my proposed title today, Pride and Profit, right? So we're kind of balancing this idea of there's pride of distinction of being enrolled in such a program. And at the same time, we're balancing that with the anticipated capital, the profits that will come as a result of being admitted and enrolled into such programs. And that kind of makes for a very interesting, tenuous balance. Second question we asked was, how can we study this phenomenon? Now, Hamid and colleagues, this would result in a rather simplistic understanding of mandating a medium of instruction. So the alternative would be then to take a close-up, on-the-ground understanding of how EMI policies get implemented at the institutional, meso, and the classroom micro level. To that end, the work by Nancy Hornberger and her colleagues might aid us in our investigation by virtue of their ecologically oriented ethnography of language planning and policy, or LPP approach. A little bit of background, and some of you probably, or most of you probably know this already, but about 25 years ago, Tom Risento and Nancy Hornberger put out this seminal article that was published in TESOL Quarterly, titled Unpeeling the Onion, Language Planning and Policy and ELT Professional. And so, of course, language policy was presented as something that is multi-layered. And in the follow-up to that article, David Castles-Johnson and Nancy Hornberger talked about slicing the onion ethnographically in order to examine layers and spaces in multilingual language education policy and practice. In their 2007 article, they said this: Risento and Hornberger introduced the metaphor of an onion to evoke the multiple layers in accounting for activity in all layers. So a lot of the earlier work before then had been conducted at the macro level, and to some extent the meso and micro levels were overlooked. But they're not alone in this endeavor, right? Other people have also taken on an ethnographic language policy perspective. They include Suresh Kanagaraja, Terry McCarthy, and these scholars have examined how people create, interpret, and at times resist language policy and planning. What's interesting, of course, by taking an ethnographic lens, in many ways we get to foreground individual agency and examine that in relation to the complexities of local processes of policy, interpretation, and implementation. Within SLA, and this is a model that comes from the Douglas Fir group, I do want to say that the ecological approach is also represented in this nested figure that you see here. But this model, this framework has been applied to language learning and language teaching. And so you get the idea of the multiple layers or scales, the micro, the meso, and macro, and how these different levels interact with each other to shape language learning and language teaching. So come back to this figure that I presented to you earlier, and this was really the driving force in our special issue. As I said, we wanted to look at how transnational higher education played out in the lives of students, teachers, and administrators. So it, in many ways, taking that multi-layered approach that I've been talking about. So I'm going to, in the remainder of this presentation, draw on 5 examples from the different special issues that I mentioned. The first example comes from Sarah Hillman and colleagues. This is the title of their article. And in this piece, they looked at EMI and the International Branch Campus situated at Texas A&M University at Qatar. Okay. So specifically, when they looked at the institution's policy from the top, there seemed to be an imposition of a standard English ideology. After all, the curriculum offered at this branch campus was identical to the ones offered at the main campus in College Station, Texas. Students had to score a minimum or get a minimum score of 6.0 on their IELTS. And if they wanted to enroll in first year rhetoric and composition, Hillman and colleagues found that there were, of course, tensions between top-down policies, the policy that was coming from the top, that it had to be an English-only policy at the IBC or International Branch Campus. And that kind of ran up against bottom-up linguistic practices. On the right, you see here pictures of the linguistic landscape that was constituted on campus. So it's not just English, as you can see. Arabic coexists alongside English. So in their work, they collected data that included classroom observations, interviews, and they also administered a survey. And essentially what they found was that a translanguaging pedagogy was being enacted in the classroom. Moving on now to my third question, what are the consequences of EMI, and HE programs? I'll refer back to the special issue here. I know it's a little small, but on the left, you see the contents page. And I'm going to direct you to 2 studies very briefly from that collection. One is by Amy O, Michelle Gu, and Francis Halt, and the other by McGill and Fan Le Ha. Both studies were conducted in China. Okay, so regarding the first study by Wu and Costa, to be lower at the university where their research was cited, and they also noticed that there was an emergent separation and stratification of languages, with English being more highly valued than Chinese on the campus. Meng and Fan found that the faculty who taught English content subjects lacked English proficiency. And what was really rather disturbing was they discovered that there was very limited interaction for international and local Chinese students because of different academic tracks and separate living arrangements. Their title, the title of their article is very aptly titled, "We Have No Chinese Classmates, International Students, Internationalization and Medium of Instruction in Chinese Universities." And these were the participants in their study. As you can see, very multinational, right? Students who came from all over the world. And yet these students were claiming that they did not have any Chinese classmates. And that makes us think about not just the stratification of languages, but also the separation of peoples on campus. I turn now to the second example that I'm going to elaborate a little bit more on, and that's the study by, as mentioned earlier, Amy O, Michelle Gu, and Francis Halt. Their piece is titled "Discursive Ripple Effects in Language Policy and Practice." So a few more pictures of the linguistic landscape at the university where their research was cited. As you can see, it's not just English only. In this case, Chinese is represented along with English. And this is the notice board, right? As you can see, it's not monolingual at all. There are students like the participants in Meng and Fan study also came from a broad range of countries. I'll give you a minute to look at the countries of origin of the participants. And also I ask you to look at the rightmost column where you see the different languages that constituted the multilingual repertoires of their participants. So what's interesting is Mila, who's a fourth year student from the US, said, and I'm just going to read this to you, I think there's a hidden transcript in a public transcript. Public transcript is like a dialogue or like communication that happens that everyone can see. I feel like that's mostly English and then sometimes Chinese. Chinese is also a lot more like a hidden transcript outside the academic space. And what about the other languages, right? We saw the multilingual repertoires that we on the previous slide. Well, Miller goes on to say there's a lot of different languages on campus. It's just among small groups and like not as noticeable. And so that kind of takes the form of a kind of a hidden transcript. Another student from Hannah from Ethiopia talked about how she had learned Chinese, maybe through a more of a book approach, through exams and all that, and she got good grades in exams, but she didn't feel confident talking in Chinese. And she goes on to say, well, when I see my fluency outside of the classroom, I don't think that I'm that fluent. Now, this was a campus where students were expected to develop both their Chinese and English linguistic skills, right? And so it's interesting that Hannah was saying that she didn't feel that she was quite fluent in Chinese. But on a more promising note, Wu and colleagues do report on how the ideological and implementational spaces were starting to open up on the campus. And there was a gradual shift from monolingualism or separate languages to a greater sense of diversity. Amy, who's the first author, Amy Wu, in this study, reports on how Yang mentioned that the students had started to put pressure on the administration, calling for more languages to be taught. And ultimately, the provost, who had a rather consultative approach with the student population and held regular meetings, over time, they started to offer more languages, as Patricia, fourth-year student, said. And so that's how French and Spanish courses began to be introduced. This is some data from their study, okay? And then what we see, of course, is how students as language arbiters start to put pressure on people, the administrators from above, and in many ways, take language policy matters into their own hands. And therefore, what we see, of course, is this opening up of ideological and implemental spaces. So yes, students as agentive language arbiters is one key takeaway from this study. I mentioned at the start that I'll be looking at two phenomena. The second phenomenon that I'm going to be looking at is global academic publishing. And I'm going to take a slight detour. So hold that thought about EMI, TNHE. I'll come back to it in a while. We'll take a slight detour in this direction. And I'm going to frame it in relation to neoliberal education and linguistic entrepreneurship. Of course, many of you are aware that in the last 10 years or so, we've been reading a lot about neoliberalism in applied linguistics. Luisa Martin Rojo talks about how neoliberalism is more than just an ideology. She says it is a form of practice, is a form and a practice of governance, specifically your governing modes of social organization and modes of self-constitution. So you're governing the self to a large extent. And some of you might also have more recently read this book by Abinet, The Neoliberal Imagination. But what was interesting to me was, how do we then rethink language learning under the influence of neoliberalism? And because neoliberalism, through different means, such as enterprise culture, celebrates initiative and resilience, the emphasis on human capital, results in the need to develop capital and to manage it. And of course, we see a commodification of language, where language becomes an economic resource. So what happens then is language learning, the whole endeavor gets reconstituted as an entrepreneurial self-development project. And there's therefore a rise, and this complements this rise in the skills discourse, as Bonnie Ursioli talks about, right, where social acts are cast in transactional or in entrepreneurial frame, and individuals are seen as gathering bundles of skills. So to summarize, language learning becomes a self-development project that's entrepreneurial in nature. Language learners are cast as entrepreneurs. And institutions and individuals that implement language policies are therefore seeking to create the ideal neoliberal worker. And this, in a way, kind of complements the notion of self-management that Bernard Spolsky has talked about more recently, that entails the modification of the language repertoire of individual learners. That leads us to ask, who is the ideal or an ideal subject in a neoliberal age? As Wendy Brown mentions, neoliberalism figures individuals as rational and having the capacity for self-care. And the model neoliberal citizen is one who strategizes for herself or himself among a host of options. That kind of brings me to this idea of linguistic entrepreneurship that I've been developing with my colleagues, Joseph Park and Lionel Wee. I place it in 3 parts because this has been a 5-year-long project, and we've used the last 5 years to think through this notion of linguistic entrepreneurship. In our first salvo in 2016 in the Asia Pacific Education Researcher, we put forward this definition of linguistic entrepreneurship as constituting the act of aligning with the moral imperative to strategically exploit language-related resources for enhancing one's worth in the world. Now, that's quite a mouthful. So basically, to put it more simply, what it means is that individual learners feel this compelling moral obligation to learn languages, to enhance their worth and to make themselves competitive. Okay, and from that stance, we emphasize the affective, cultural, and moral dimensions of neoliberalism, which subsequently gets internalized by students. What's new about linguistic entrepreneurship? Well, for one, it foregrounds neoliberal subjecthood in the reframing of language learning. In other words, we want to recast individuals and institutions in such a way that they are aligned with neoliberal values. So this was the first piece that I mentioned earlier. Here is an example that appeared in the 2016 article. It comes from Beso, his research on transnational experiences of educational migration. Be interviewed Ji Yong, a 10-year-old Korean student who was studying in a Singapore government school. And Bei asked Ji Yong's mother, do you think English will play an important role in realizing her dreams in the future? And Ji Yong's mother said, yes, language, either English or Chinese, will be important when she wants to study abroad later. What's interesting is the mom goes on to say, once she goes to middle school, she will know what her dream is, and then she'll be responsible for it. So this, we have a mother saying, you know, this middle schooler will be responsible for making her dream happen. Okay. Mom also goes on to say that her generation is much more globalized than her generation, and that there are many foreigners in Korea, and learning English will allow opportunities to interact with them. Now, in the 2016 piece, we focus on the individual learner, but in the follow-up, in the 2019 article that was published in Language Policy, we turned our attention to the organization. In other words, we wanted to see how linguistic entrepreneurship played out on the organizational level. Specifically, we gave an example of how, in fact, not just industries, but countries themselves often put out competitive rankings as for the purpose of management and control. Going back to Martin Rojo, competitiveness represents the expansion of a neoliberal logic to all countries. It shapes competitiveness, shapes subjects, and converts them into entrepreneurs capable of seizing opportunities for profit. And we subsequently get engulfed in a constant process of competition. Part 3. So fast forward to 2021. we've developed this idea a little bit more, and we found a group of colleagues to assemble a special issue that appeared in Multilingual earlier this year. So if you'd like to know more about linguistic entrepreneurship, I direct you to the introduction to our special issue that I co-authored with Park and Wee. But what I'm going to do is focus on another example, one by my former student, Wendy Lee, who's now in Nagoya, and me. Okay, and it's titled Problematizing Enterprise Culture in Global Academic Publishing, Linguistic Entrepreneurship Through the Lens of Two Chinese Visiting Scholars in a US University. So global academic publishing is a phenomenon that has been widely researched. Mary Jane Curry and Teresa Lillis have been looking at it for a number of years. In their 2017 book, they pointed out that publishing in English brings with it prestige and material rewards, and it allows for international exchanges of ideas and research to happen. But if you do not publish in English, and that can have a whole series of drawbacks as well that include being held back in terms of your career advancement, not being promoted, not getting salary increases, the lack of eligibility to have access to doctoral students. You wouldn't be able to supervise them, or you might not have access to receiving research funding. They go on to add that there is growing pressure to publish in English, but at the same time, we need to remember that there is a trade-off, right? If you do publish in English, what does that mean about publishing in local languages for local audiences? And how then do you subsequently sustain local research on other communities? At the same time, Lillis and Curry remind us that not all multilingual scholars have equal or even access to the material and discursive resources that support English medium academic publishing. So now I turn your attention to academic publishing in China. I've been working out of China for a number of years now. And the truth is this perish or publish concern is not just something that we would face only in North America. It's kind of universal, and it's certainly being making its presence felt in China. And here are some articles that direct you to the work that has been done on the growing pressure to publish in China. In a 2019 article that was published in Applied Linguistics, there was a review of articles in the field that were published between 2005 to 2016, and you can see how China's ranking, as we move from left to right, has gone up over the years. So there is certainly immense pressure to put out publications. Yongyan Zheng and Xiaoyan Huo, in their 2019 article in Language Policy, talked about the challenges and opportunities of Chinese multilingual scholars' language practices in academic publishing. Specifically, they said that English medium research is more likely to be indexed compared to research published in other languages, which are less valued. Multilingual publishing is often dismissed as easy and even less worthy. And they go on to say that what happens is this phenomenon then reflects the center-periphery ideology in knowledge construction. Okay, and that what we need to know is that research published in other geological places and in other languages is often sidelined and even trivialized. Now, we need to see this in conjunction with what's happening at the macro level, right, in terms of Chinese government policy. In 2015, the Chinese government put out this plan to develop world-class universities and first-class disciplines. In doing so, they emphasized entrepreneurship education, and they were seeking to promote international exchanges and cooperation with world-class universities in order to strengthen the international collaboration and to attract foreign students to China. And the results, it's been relatively successful, I would say. If you look at the 2021 Times Higher Education University ranking, in the top 25, we have now Tsinghua University ranked at number 20, and then Peking or Beta ranked at 23. So it's certainly borne fruits, right, in that sense. I turn very briefly back to our study and two participants with whom we worked, Hugo and Haley. Remember, these are visiting scholars at a US university. Haley talked about starting from 2020, applicants under the age of 45 were expected to have at least 6 months overseas study or visiting experience. At Hugo's University, there was a way to measure, to evaluate your research workload. And that if you were, of course, in a research-oriented track, on the one hand, you got more opportunities to do research, but there was also, that came with that increasing pressures to publish. What is also interesting at Hugo's University was that not all paper publications were regarded to be equal. If you published in an SSCI journal or an ANHCI journal, you were assigned a higher score. And impact factor matters, right, as you can see here. But if you published in a Chinese journal, then you assigned a lower score. So what Zheng and Guo talked about was that we have, therefore, a de facto language policy in publishing in English, with the Anglophone-centered textual ideology adversely affecting multilingual scholars in non-Anglophone contexts. Okay, and this then brings us to, I would say, the dark side of enterprise culture. Because when you have a ranking system like what I showed you earlier at Hugo School, or promotion, this ultimately creates a very competitive work environment. Okay, and what happens, of course, you get a situation where competitive relations between enterprising subjects, in this case academics, begins to emerge. I mentioned earlier there's a lot of pressure to seek collaboration as well with overseas scholars. In this piece by Yongyan Li and Guang Weihu that came out in 2018, there's, of course, a strong demand to collaborate with overseas scholars, specifically with the goal of co-authoring publications in international journals. Going back to Hugo and Haley, our focal participants, I want to present them as linguistic entrepreneurs. Many of you are probably familiar with the phenomenon of visiting scholars. Very often, almost every other week, I get an email from someone and asking me if I would be willing to host them at my university. More often than not, scholars from China have already secured funding from the government, and what they need is a host and a host institution. Okay, and more often than not, as we see here, the goal is to expand their experience, their academic experience, to enhance their current academic skills and to cooperate with foreign scholars. In our study, we sought to explore this concern. How did two Chinese visiting scholars negotiate linguistic entrepreneurship, and what were its effects? There were a number of themes. I'm not going to go through all of them. I'm going to jump to the fourth theme here and invite you to look at the article if you're interested in learning more about our findings. And I'm jumping to the theme of adjusting to the demands of linguistic entrepreneurship. So this is Haley, all right? And she talks about how when teachers apply for visiting scholar programs, there has been an increasing value placed on SSCI publication, and that your overseas experience is closely related to your promotion. If you're an English teacher and you've never been to English-speaking countries, you are incompetent, or you're made to feel incompetent. And what's really the punchline here, and very disturbingly, she says, everyone can teach. Teaching is not a big deal. It is your publications that matter the most. With Hugo, he had something else to say, and he talked about how he had never learned English academic writing systematically. And then he goes on to say that if you want to publish in their journals, their meaning Western-based journals in Anglophone countries, you have to know how they write, the emphasis being they, right? On they write academic papers. He adds, I tried my best to alter my Chinese way of writing academic papers and adjust myself to English academic writing model. So here's the research concern again. But what were the effects, right? So in Haley's case, she felt very stressed. She was in the US with her daughter. Her husband stayed back in China. And she talks about how her daughter had experienced difficulty adjusting to the new school. I had to support her and tutor her English every day. I didn't know anyone in the university except for my classmates. The only thing I enjoyed at the time was this woman Bible study group. I felt mentally relieved in this group. And she talks about how I think this supportive spirit was very helpful to her. Hugo, looking back on his sojourn in the US, said, I felt lonely when I was there. Most of the time, I just stayed in my apartment or the library working on different papers. On reflection, he said, if I had another chance, I would reach out to more people. So in summary, I think what we need to think about are the effective dimensions of linguistic entrepreneurship. On the one hand, individuals feel a moral obligation to cast or recast themselves as neoliberal workers. But on the other hand, these individuals often experience a great deal of stress and frustration. I must end my detour here and kind of take us back to the special issue and to revisit the idea of the first phenomenon of EMI, TNHE. I'm turning to the fifth example here, work by my colleague Osman Banawi in Saudi Arabia. Okay, and it's titled EMI Come Acceleration Policy in the Contemporary Transnational Higher Education Market. Banawi has this book, encourage you, invite you to look at it, TESOL and the Cult of Speed in the Age of Neoliberal Mobility. He draws on the sociologist Hartmut Rosa's social theory of acceleration and zooms in specifically at the acceleration of the pace of life. So what happens is, of course, is that all of us seem to be working faster, harder. You know, we're on this treadmill, right? And we're under intense pressure to produce, to perform. Okay, and Banawi's argument is that EMI as a becomes a performative technology of acceleration in the contemporary TNHE market. So in other words, we have many universities wanting to offer EMI, TNHE programs at their institutions because their goal is to elevate the university's rankings, right? To make sure that they break into a league of tables like what I showed you earlier, like the Times Higher Education rankings. So Banawi goes on to say that EMI programs become benchmarks for claiming quality of education, securing financial resources, and promoting a global outlook. What he does, interestingly, in his study is that he interviews three different sets of people. He interviewed the language teachers, those who were teaching in the EMI context. He interviewed engineering teachers, and he also sought the views of academic administrators at the institution. What's interesting, of course, is how each set of individuals viewed the situation. The language teachers felt that they couldn't tag language learning within a time frame. As we all know, it takes time to learn a language, and that language is learning is very much a complex process, and what we need is flexibility. Now compare that with the views of the engineering teachers who felt that they were under strong pressure in that they were being measured against rigorous KPI or key performance indicators, which took the form of annual business plans and weekly reports. But what did the administrators have to say? Well, the head of quality assurance said that reading the market and acting fast are the best keys to our success. So what you have is this disconnect between the teachers and the administrators. Going back to the four questions that I put out earlier, I'd like to turn your attention now to the fourth question. What are the implications of EMI TNHE programs? So I think it's very important for us to give teachers key roles in EMI implementation and to provide them the necessary training to work effectively in EMI contexts. Three possible ways to support teachers. One would be to equip EMI teachers with the necessary skills to integrate content and language teaching. So we kind of now not staying so much on the right end of that continuum that I showed you earlier, but kind of moving towards the center, where we focus on both content and language instruction through a CLIL approach. Or we could provide discipline-specific language support for student needs. Third way to support teachers would be to consult the views of different stakeholders, such as administrators, content teachers, and students. Oh, this is a typo. This is example 6, not example 5. I apologize. So this is the final example I'm going to present to you today, and that's by Carrie Sahan. And in presenting Sahan's article, I want to circle back to the first example that I started with by Hillman and colleagues. Now, as you may remember, Hillman's study was conducted in Qatar in the Middle East. Sahan's study takes place in Turkey. All right, and what she wanted to study was how EMI instruction was implemented at a Turkish university. These were her different data sources: policy documents, classroom observations, semi-structured interviews with lecturers, and focus group discussions with students. Very much reminiscent of that ethnographic approach to language policy, that multi-layered, multi-scaled approach that I mentioned at the top of the lecture talk today, is that she looked at how policies were enacted at the macro-national level, the meso-institutional level, and the micro-classroom level. Here are the findings. In relation to language instruction in EMI programs, what's interesting is I'm going to compare the two ends, the macro and the micro. On the macro end, 30% of course credits, minimum of them had to be offered in English. But in reality, the teachers felt that the classes were supposed to be in either English or Turkish, but in practice, they ended up using both languages. Okay. In terms of the proficiency requirements, students were expected to pass the proficiency test for the preparatory program. But the truth is, many students struggled to understand concepts and that were presented in English. And they also struggled to ask questions in English. Where teacher English proficiency requirements were concerned, teachers had to get a minimum score of about 80 points on the national exam. But one teacher pointed out, the exam says nothing about how well you teach. Solving grammar on a test is not like teaching in English. So you kind of see that disconnect. So in her summary of findings, what she does, and I'm going to focus on the bottom row here, is that the micro level, even though an EMI policy was supposedly enacted at the top and expected to trickle down across to the classroom, what she found was that there was flexible and bilingual language use in EMI classes. There was reported difficulty in understanding the content in English. And that the English skills assessed on the exams did not match the competencies needed to teach. Okay, and what was interesting is the teachers never really described language learning as an explicit aim of EMI, because they didn't see themselves. The content teachers didn't see themselves as being English teachers at all. What does this lead us to surmise then? That we need to provide support, and such support can take the form of language development through and alongside EMI coursework in the form of pedagogical training or discipline-specific support classes. This is a model from Nicola Galloway and Heath Rose's article that was published in ELT Journal earlier this year. I want you to focus on the two upper quadrants. So the ideal situation would be either in the top left quadrant to provide a one-year intensive English program prior to the EMI program, according to Galloway and Rose, or the alternative would be to provide concurrent support, where students take EAP or ESP courses alongside the EMI program. Now, I do want to say that there are many ways to interpret EMI. In fact, Jack Richards and Jack Pan, in an article published in the Rec Journal earlier this year, present a typology of English medium instruction. And I also want to say in that vein that it's certainly, as we saw in both Hillman and Sahan's studies, that it is certainly not unusual and uncommon for us to find translanguaging occurring within EMI settings. So, and I direct you to this book edited by Paulsrud and colleagues. So I'm going to close here. It's about 12:53. I think we're doing quite okay for time. What are some things we need to consider as we try to explore this precarity in balancing pride and profit, right? So my question to you would be, what ideologies prevail in EMI TNHE? And you can swap EMI TNHE with any other educational phenomenon that you might be interested in investigating. Whose identities are validated in this phenomenon X that you may want to pursue? Okay. How are the emotions of individuals, for example, teachers and students, impacted by the phenomenon? What is the interrelationship between identity, ideology, and emotion? And finally, what measures can we take to allow for greater access to resources in order to achieve more equitable learning outcomes? So these are questions that I'm going to leave you with. I'm looking forward to a conversation with you next. And if you are interested in learning more about my work, I direct you to these sites.